Alright, starting off with white. First card, Ancestral Katana. 1 and a white for an artifact equipment. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, you may pay 1. When you do, attach Ancestral Katana to it. Equipped creature gets +2/+1. Certainly not a card that I think... Oh, and equip 3. Seems much too slow to be useful in any construct format. I think that one's going to be primarily limited. Samurai and Warriors has a theme about pseudo... what even was the name of that mechanic when a creature used to attack alone? Pseudo-exalted effects, where samurais or warriors that attack alone get different benefits from all of your other permanents, this being kind of, I guess, the introduction to that theme. It's hard to foresee that being useful in Constructed. Exalted wasn't really either, to the best of my knowledge. It's very finicky to try to plan any kind of constructed archetype around the idea of attacking alone, but if enough payoffs are there, maybe. But I would be surprised if that's the case. A Dawn Sky, 3 white for a legendary creature Dragon Spirit, flying and vigilance, 5/4. When it dies, choose one of the 2 effects. Either look at the top 7 cards of your library, put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Okay, wait, what does that actually mean? Okay, so we get to look at the top 7 cards of our library, and then put any number of them whose total mana value equals to 4 or less onto the battlefield. So it's a 5 mana 5/4 with vigilance that replaces itself with more or less a potentially more than a 4 drops worth of value, because usually 2 2-drops tend to be better than a 4-drop. You could also fill your deck with 0 cost non-land permanents, I suppose, if you wanted to like put Mem Knights in your deck or something. That doesn't seem like a good idea, but you do get to put as many of them as you want into play for free. So that gives some insulation against removal for something that doesn't otherwise have an ETB effect that would be necessary for a 5-drop to see play. The other mode being put 2 +1/+1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or vehicle. Alright. Hey Restakiki, I'm doing pretty well. Hierarch was pretty good. I imagine Pseudo-Exalted might be an okay bonus too. Hierarch was good, but it having Exalted was nice because it was on a creature that didn't want to attack anyway. I suppose the lesson there is that Exalted isn't inherently a bad mechanic, in the same way that Ancestral Katana and the Warrior Tribe, or Warrior Samurai Tribe, attacks alone, pseudo-exalted stuff, isn't inherently a bad mechanic. Because, again, there is no such thing as a bad mechanic. There's only mechanics that are inherently... What's the right way to put this? Okay, we'll get this whole rant out of the way. Mechanics can't be strong or weak. Only their implementation can be. And because the power level of a card is a function of every factor of the card, the mana cost, what it does, the types, how easy it is to remove, there's dozens of balance knobs on any given card. You can take any mechanic and make the card that includes that mechanic busted if you tweak the numbers around the card. And Noble Hierarch, I think, is a card with Exalted that uses it in a cool way that sometimes matters and sometimes doesn't. But the card itself is already strong, and Exalted is just a bonus on top of that. That is cool. So, we could see the Samurai and Warrior mechanic attacking alone. I would just say that it's the kind of mechanic that isn't just automatically a boost to the card. It's the kind of mechanic that requires conscientious deck building, and it might not have the tools to succeed, I suppose. How did I do in the MIQ? I suppose you could say I did pretty well, because I did manage to qualify, but no, I'm not actually eligible to participate because I was already qualified for the tournament. through the MPL. Most of the stuff I've been doing over the last week in regards to that was to help other folks prepare. Okay, so to get back to AO, an anthem, or well, a double anthem, to all the other permanents when AO dies is an interesting way to potentially stop it from getting hit by a removal spell in the middle of attacks, and for your opponent to blow you out that way. Like, if they kill your biggest creature, which this presumably is, then it still puts power on other attacking creatures. So this is part of a cycle that I have two main concerns about. One, is it part of an archetype that wants to play something this expensive anyway? Namely, this card seems like it wants to go in a white aggro deck. Do white aggro decks need 5 mana top-ends? Currently, their top end is usually Legion Angel, if that. And I think Legion Angel is probably stronger than this. They certainly don't want to try to get up to 5 mana. The other concern is how much of the removal in the format ends up being exile-based. Because Esper and White-Black in Standard tend to use a lot of exile-based removal. Historic tends to have less exile-based removal that could hit this. More of the removal is board wipes that this is decent against, or single target removal like Unholy Heat that this is decent against. So aside from the fact that Historic is a faster format and it's harder to play 5-drops, I think it lines up better against the removal there. Alchemy tends to be most of the same removal spells as Standard. A pretty significant percentage of it is exile-based. That may end up changing. What removal spells are popular tends to be dictated by the cards in the format and what removal spells are good against what, but yeah, this is part of a whole cycle of 5-drops that have these death triggers, and yeah, nervous about that. But you don't know. Might be that removal spells like Abrade become more popular if artifacts are a major thing, and well, I guess a 5-drop doesn't die to Abrade anyway, but yeah, there's the possibility that things aren't super exile heavy, but that seems to be where the impetus is at. Has to be better options in Historic. I would assume so, but the other thing to consider is that these creatures are much better if you have sacrifice outlets. That's not necessarily relevant for the white dragon, but say one in the Jund colors, if you have like Woe Strider or Cauldron Familiar, you get some insulation against exile-based removal. Because you could always choose to sacrifice it in response to some removal spell. So maybe that's interesting, but I don't see AO making an impact with the format as it stands. I think the stats and the effects are probably good for Standard and probably Alchemy, but not if the current patterns of what removal spells see play remain unchanged. Next up, Banishing Slash. White, sorcery, destroy up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. That's immediately confusing. The card called Banishing Slash doesn't exile. Then if you control an artifact and an enchantment, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. Artifact, enchantment, or tapped creature. Okay, so at sorcery speed, and with a slightly less friendly mana cost, we have Naturalize that can also hit tapped creatures, and that comes with a creature if we control an artifact and enchantment. That's interesting. The mana cost is really restrictive, but if the expectation is that it's not really going to be a Naturalize you want to play on turn 2, but is instead going to be a Naturalize you play on like turn 5 or 6, just at some point in the mid-game, Artifact and Enchantment is hard to enable, but maybe with the right deck you could do that. And the flexibility of hitting tapped creatures is also interesting. I don't think this is the kind of thing you would immediately want to play over other instant speed naturalize effects, but I could see the right deck where it just so happens that it's kind of trivial to have an artifact and enchantment in play. Being happy playing this. Probably still not as a main deck card necessarily, unless the meta really incentivized destroying artifacts or enchantments. But as a sideboard card, probably. Hitting tapped creatures is also a really interesting, possibly very good fringe benefit. I don't know exactly how to rate that. I feel like you would probably still only bring this in if you were looking for a naturalize effect, and then you would just be excited if you managed to snag a tapped creature with it in a spot where that was valuable. And maybe if you bring it in to answer an artifact out of a combo deck or something, then your opponent has to play around with it, or play around the ability for it to destroy tapped creatures. Destroying Urza Saga is kind of cool, I suppose. Naturalize does already do that, and there's a lot of 1-mana ways to do it in formats where Urza Sagas exists. I don't think this is going to see play in older formats because it's hard to actually get the Samurai token. Like, compare this to Reclamation Sage, which is an okay, fine card that mostly ends up seeing play in collected company lists. And this isn't, like, terribly better than that. In fact, it's probably worse than Rec Sage most of the time. So, although the Samurai creature token is nice, I think that the main reason this would have appeal is the flexibility of, oh, well, sometimes it hits a tapped creature, and that's actually just really nice to have access to. Sorcery speed's not very great versus combo? No, it's not. But it's a matter of how useful it is against specific types of decks, I guess. Like, this wouldn't be playable against Wilderness Reclamation, where you absolutely have to have your enchantment removal be instant speed, but it might be playable against some of the historic artifact combo decks that try to play like Hedron Archive or Paradox Engine, maybe? Maybe those are slow enough that sorcery speed isn't a huge downgrade? I don't know. Like I said, I think it'll be contextual to what kind of decks are there where you really want artifact enchantment destruction, and when your opponent doesn't draw the artifact or enchantment, do you want to blow up just a random creature? Okay, so for example, I think this could be a really interesting card if your goal out of bringing it out of the sideboard is to blow up something like Rest in Peace, that's just going to sit on the board and being annoying, but when your opponent doesn't draw that really important random enchantment, it can just kill a creature instead. Going to be a really strong removal spell unlimited? Maybe, depending on how reliable you can have an artifact and enchantment. Usually naturalize effects aren't terribly good and limited, and destroying tapped creatures at sorcery speed also isn't terribly good, which makes it a flexible card choosing between a couple of not good modes. But, yeah, still playable. If you're in white, you probably play it every time. I just don't know how highly you draft it. Befriending the Moths. We've seen a lot of moth-based art recently, and I feel like I'm a huge fan of this. 3 and a white for a saga. First and second chapters. Target creature you control gains +1/+1 and flying until the end of turn. Third mode, exile this saga and return to the battlefield transformed under your control. You get a 2/4 with flying. Imperial Moth. Well, that's probably just a limited card. Maybe if this costs like 2 mana, it might be constructed playable. So I suppose this is a decent time to introduce the idea that I've been fiddling around with, which is there's a lot of sagas in this set that flip into creatures. and it's very easy to blink creatures, and if you do, you get the Saga again. This card isn't powerful enough to make that relevant, but something I'm going to be kind of keeping my eye on is I'm really interested to see if there are some Sagas that is strong, or that are strong enough to make that a build-around interaction. I've played a lot of Sagas with Yorion, and one of the biggest problems with Sagas is that after the final mode, they got rid of themselves, so you couldn't build up a huge number of Sagas to blink with Yorion very easily. And if the Sagas stuck around after you got all the benefit out of them, that would have been an improvement. We shall see. We shall see. Maybe I'm the only one that's not that excited for the new set. I don't know. I haven't seen enough of the set to know whether to be excited for it or not yet. So maybe we'll have a judgment on that by the time this is all over. I suppose it also depends on what kind of a format you're interested in. Usually, standard sets tend to have lower impacts on older formats. Next card, Blade Blizzard Kitsune. 2 and a white for a 2/2 creature fox ninja with ninjutsu. 3 and a white. Ninjutsu being pay the cost, return an unblocked attacker you control a hand, which means you have to do it after blockers are declared, and then you put this card onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, still unblocked. And it is a 2/2 with double strike, which seems entirely limited only, although 3 mana 2/2 with double strike on its own is already probably a pretty good card. So no constructed implication. Born to Drive, 2 and a white, enchantment aura, enchant artifact or creature. As long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1 for each creature and or artifact you control. Channel, 2 and a white. Discard Born to Drive, create 2/1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens with this creature crew's vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. Interesting. Okay, so this is our first introduction to Channel, which is that you get to discard the card and pay the channel cost to get some effect. So notably, one of the reasons that's interesting is it's not casting a spell similar to cycling Shark Typhoon, which means that it isn't counterable. Channel is instant speed, yes. It does not specify otherwise. So you can put 2 creatures into play with this at instant speed that crew vehicles if you want to, I don't know, do some kind of blocking shenanigans with your vehicles. Because for 3 mana, this puts essentially 6 power worth of crew into play. If there's a vehicle deck, maybe that's interesting enough to be worth messing around with. I don't expect you're going to use the enchantment half of it terribly often. Playing enchantments is generally kind of a recipe for getting blown out as a 2-for-1. And giving a permanent +1/+1 for each creature and or vehicle you control isn't probably going to be too much very often. But if a deck that wants to play this for the channel cost exists, then there are going to be times where Born to Drive just randomly turns into, oh, you don't have a flying blocker and you're tapped out? Well, I guess I'll enchant my thing you can't block for +5/+5 to kill you. That'd be good. But probably going to be completely contextual based on whether or not there are playable vehicle decks, I wager. And that's going to be, well, hold on. How many playable vehicles do we already have in Standard? We have Isika's Chariot. And Plow? Is Plow in Standard? I think Plow's in Historic only. But yeah, plow into this. You do crew, plow, and attack. That's true. Plow is in Kaldheim? Is it? I thought it was from Theros. Oh wow, it is from Kaldheim. Interesting. Alright, yeah, so we can do plow into Born to Drive. Plow typically costs how much to crew? 6? Alright. I question... I'm not sure exactly what the flavor is of two pilots who were born to drive a plow. Take issue with the claim that plow is playable. If there's enough stuff that automatically crews vehicles, plow... If plow is a 2 mana 6/3 attacker that makes 3 mana when it attacks and gains 3 life, I mean, that immediately pays for your Born to Drive. That's certainly tempo. That's a lot of tempo. Alright. It's the remainder of the vehicle shell around that I'm uncertain of, but yeah, alright. Next up, Brilliant Restoration. 3 and quadruple white, 7 mana total. Sorcery, return all artifacts and enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Well, I feel like we've seen this before, and I don't see this seeing play. This seems way too expensive. Maybe there's a combo deck that has this kind of effect go off. That isn't impossible, but graveyard strategies are already the thing in Historic that are getting the most incidental hate, including main deck hate, so I would not be excited about trying to play it there. And Standard seems to Standard and Alchemy both seem to be a mess of either counterspells or decks just playing multiple copies of Go Blank. And Go Blank is extremely good against 7-drops that require you to make a ton of land drops and to have a graveyard. Probably... I don't immediately see any way to use this, but it's certainly a combo card, and combo cards are the hard ones to account for. It just takes the right shell to go from terrible to good, but yeah, I'm not seeing it as it stands. Cloudsteel Kieran. 2 and a white for a 3/2 artifact creature equipment Kieran. This is probably a fine time to note that there are cards in this set that have multiple types, in this case artifact and creature, and then have subtypes listed on the right that are subtypes of their respective types and not of each type, which is to say equipment is not a creature type. There are shrines in this set that are creatures, that are enchantment creatures with the subtypes, I think just only shrine, that people took as meaning that shrine was a creature type, which is not the case. Those are creatures with the enchantment subtype shrine and no creature subtypes. So that little bit of judge out of the way. The rest of this card is flying. Equipped creature has flying, and you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Reconfigure 5. Reconfigure being equip, except you can also unequip with reconfigure. You actually couldn't unequip with equipment unless you had a different target to equip it to, which came up a lot if you stole an equipped creature that was equipped with their permanent. Sometimes they couldn't actually unequip that permanent. But in this case, okay, so 3 mana 3/2 flyer. You can pay 5 mana to equip it to something else, and you've got yourself a Platinum Angel, I guess? You can't equip creatures, at least until they change the rules. Meaning with this, Or is that just like a cheeky joke that you technically can't... Right. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. If you manage to give a creature an equip ability, which is technically possible, you couldn't equip a creature to a creature to something else. And if an equipment became a creature, it became unequipped as a rules action. Presumably, Reconfigure is going to come with a rules update, specifically with Reconfigure, that will allow it to stop being a creature when it's equipped to something. Fernando Diniz BH, thanks for the follow. Glad you're enjoying the stream. Ooh. Did you see the new rule that vehicles can't crew themselves? Really? I did not see that. That'll be an interesting update. It wasn't relevant super often, but it did mean that if your opponent was stealing a vehicle from you, you could tap it to itself. It was also relevant with Magda sometimes, if you turned your vehicles into dwarves. In fact, the rules update is in the reminder text. Sort of. It doesn't actually explain it completely. I imagine there's going to be some kind of rules minutia on Reconfigure that defines what happens if a card has both Reconfigure and Equip. An equipment that's also a creature can't equip a creature. Yes, but Reconfigure presumably is going to have rules text that, as part of activating Reconfigure, removes the creature type. So you don't run into that problem. What will be very interesting is, I'm curious to see what happens if you give Cloudsteel Kieran an equip ability, and then reconfigure it onto a creature, and then try to use the equip ability to equip it to something else. Would it turn back into a creature at that point? Reconfigure is not equip, it attaches? Right, so equip is a ability that ends up attaching the equipment to something. Am I a fan of Reconfigure? Probably. I mean, I'm a fan of every mechanic, but inherently it takes a little bit of time to figure out if a mechanic ends up creating interesting gameplay. To be honest, most of the fun in Magic is not something that's like inherent to the way the rules work. It's something that is derived from the way that they interact. So whether a mechanic is good and cool or fun or not has more to do with what sort of derived interactions arise with other stuff, and that's kind of hard to judge. I could see Reconfigure being cool. I think generally board states with more options and more meaningful choices tend to be board states that create more entertaining games. And at a glance, without having played with them, Reconfigure seems like the kind of thing that accomplishes that. Ugh. Seems convoluted? Maybe. I think that it'll be probably relatively understandable once we have some reps in. Certainly, it is not Mutate. And Mutate was a mechanic that I thought was reasonably fun, but is the most convoluted thing we've ever had in Magic. This is nowhere near as bad as that. Did you know you can't mutate onto a human? Because I didn't. Until I did. And then I lost that game. Oh, right. Cloudsteel Kieran, I'm going to guess probably not actually a good card. I don't think a 3-mana 3/2 flyer is good, and that's most of what this card is. And it seems like it would be relatively easy to kill the Reconfigure thing. Most limited decks tend to have removal. But maybe there's something you can equip this to that's indestructible, and then maybe you've got a plan? I don't know. Seems like you would play it in Limited? Yes, but you would play a 3/2 flyer vanilla in Limited. I don't know if you would play it more highly than that, but that's something you would already play highly. Next up, Dragonfly Suit. 2 and a white for a 3/2 artifact vehicle flying with crew 1. That seems like a limited only card, so we gonna skip it. A Ganjo Exemplar. 1 and a white for a 2/1 enchantment creature human samurai. Enchantment creature. Interesting to note that those exist. So perhaps it is actually just much more feasible, at least in Limited, maybe in Constructed as well, to get artifact and enchantment types in play. For cards that care about that. You can mutate onto your opponent's permanents as long as both the mutate spell and the target share an owner. Right, and you can't mutate onto stuff you stole. I forgot about that. Yeah, reconfigure. Super simple and straightforward compared to that. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Limited only, but actually probably a pretty good limited card because it attacks as a 3 or 2 mana 3/2. I do dig any limited card that does that. Era of Enlightenment Saga. 1 and a white for scry 2, then gain 2 life, then exile this card and return it to the battlefield as a 2/2 with first strike. I guess that's fine. Seems limited only. The Fall of Lord Konda. 2 and a white for a saga. First chapter, exile target creature and opponent controls with mana value 4 or greater. Second chapter, each player gains control of all permanents they own. Alright. That's not, like, super impactful in gameplay terms, but it is a very cute reference to the lore of the original Kamigawa set and how Konda was the villain who stole that which was taken. Third mode, exile and return to the battlefield. You get a 1/3 defender that when it dies, you draw a card. Which is... So the sequencing on this is kind of weird, because it's not actually a 3-drop in the sense that you really can only play it once your opponent has something with mana value 4 or greater. And at that point, it's a kind of off-curve removal spell. Like, if your opponent plays a 4-drop, you don't really want to be playing this on turn 4, and then trying to find a way to spend 1 more mana. But it does eventually draw a card. So, like, compared to the closest approximation I can think of is Binding of the Old Gods. This seems kind of equivalent and worse. Because you don't ramp, you do eventually get to draw a card. This is one of those cards that I think could have potential, but only in the sense that blinking Fragment of Konda to get the first chapter again needs to be something powerful enough and easy enough that it's worth doing. If that comes together, if this can, like, answer their 4-drop Planeswalker and then a couple of turns later you blink it to answer their follow-up 4 or 5-drop Planeswalker, Standard is mid-rangey enough that that might be viable. Oh, it only hits creature. Okay, never mind. This sucks. Good call. Very bad. Moving on. Farewell. 4 white for a sorcery. Choose 1 or more. Interesting. Exile all artifacts. Exile all creatures. Exile all enchantments. Exile all graveyards. Notably lacks planeswalkers. 1 or more is fascinating. So, most obvious case is a board wipe that hits creatures. Exile over destroy is interesting. Huh. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that this card is actually really cool against food in Historic. That you actually get rid of Trail of Crumbs, all food tokens, all ovens, all cats, and you get rid of the cats out of the graveyard? Yeah, I'm inclined to believe that this replaces anything that runs Cleansing Nova. I don't know if any matchup comes to mind. I guess maybe this is good against like Phoenix too? That it clears out their graveyard and all their Phoenixes in play at the same time? Huh. Yeah, definitely replaces Cleansing Nova against the Enchantress decks. I'm entirely interested. 6 mana is a lot. I don't think this would ever be like a card you're super happy to play. It needs to be the card that you board into with the expectation that it totally just dominates a matchup when you're boarding it in. Because it needs to kind of just win the game for 6 mana in anything older than Standard. Yeah, alright. It's hard to resolve against Phoenix, given that it's a 6-drop, but Phoenix doesn't like to play counter spells if it doesn't have to anyway. I think this one has potential. Go Shintai of Shared Purpose. 3 and a white for a legendary enchantment creature shrine. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that it just has no creature types at all. It is... the shrine is an enchantment subtype. So anything that cares about creature types, shrine not choosable. So 1/3 with Vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token for each shrine you control. I can't say that we've ever seen a competitive shrine deck, and this does not seem like something that's likely to change that. So for 5 mana, basically, you get this and some 1/1s with it, minimum 1. That's probably not good, but it is mostly just a question of how deep do you want to go into your shrine deck, I guess. Worth noticing that Lotus Field makes Farewell easier to cast. That's true. I think most of the matchups that I just named, other than Phoenix, were matchups where Lotus Field wasn't terribly unfavored, but yeah, Lotus Field is a lot less concerned with the mana cost and a lot more concerned with the immediate game recovery impact to rebuy tempo from early turns of doing nothing. Yeah, Shrines, probably still a meme deck. Can't really give that a fair evaluation. Shrines are not competitive, but I'm interested in Super Aggro Enchantment deck that uses the green Champion of the Parish for enchantments, Ranger class, and all these enchantment creatures, and aura. I think the problem with that is that sounds like a good deck if you use the green Enchantment Champion on curve and then, like, support it with every other enchantment on curve. But what happens when you don't draw the green enchantment reward card? The rest of your deck doesn't really come together to do anything special without that. And you gotta have redundant plans in your deck for when you don't find the key piece. Okay. Golden Tail Disciple, 2 and a white for a 2/3 enchantment creature Fox Monk. Lifelink. Okay, limited. Konkeso, thanks for the follow. Glad you're enjoying the stream. Catilda's good 3-drop for the deck. Yeah, I suppose Catilda is nice with enchantments. Did Catilda... was it only enchantments? Was it enchantments or creatures? Oh, spirits and or enchantments. Got it. Yeah, it's possible there's enough enchantment payoff, but I don't know of enough, really. Historic gets there, but it's got like 16 playable enchantments payoffs at 3 or less mana. And even then doesn't want to play, like, if you have enchantment payoffs, you're not super incentivized to play expensive enchantments. You're incentivized to play low-cost enchantments because you want to play multiple enchantments in one turn. Which makes me think trying to go 4-mana shrines is not the right answer. Next up, Hotshot Mechanic. Single white for a 2/1 artifact creature Fox Pilot. Hotshot Mechanic crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. Okay, so let's see. That means that it crews Chariot on its own in Standard, though not in any format where Chariot is nerfed, like Alchemy. And it is a Savannah Lions that isn't legendary. And also, oh, it's an artifact? Huh. I missed that. Interesting. It does not take much at all to make Savannah Lions playable. So in any situation where the artifact creature type, or the artifact typing on this creature is relevant, this is already probably totally solid. And any deck that has any vehicle at all that you care about crewing, especially crewing off of a top deck Hotshot Mechanic, that seems good. Yeah, alright. I mean, I would say probably like 80% of this card's power level is just, does a deck want a Savannah Lions? And the answer to that for a lot of aggressive white decks is yes. Imperial Oath. 5 and a white for a sorcery. Create 3 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance. Scry 3. It seems like a good limited card. Probably, if you can afford to play 6 drops, but I mean, scry 3 and 6 power for 6 mana is pretty good at common for white. Imperial Recovery Unit. 2 and a white for a 3/4 artifact vehicle. When Imperial Recovery Unit attacks, return target creature or vehicle card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Crew 2. Okay. That seems like not enough stats and not enough value for 3 mana at constructed, but the crew cost is pretty low, and 4 toughness is a pretty decent amount. I could see in a world where removal didn't line up well against this, that maybe this actually does see some constructed play. Anything with a low enough crew cost. Oh, it's graveyard to hand, not graveyard to battlefield. Well, this could actually see play. It's a little expensive. I don't think that it's like strong enough that you'd want to build a deck around it, but it is probably possible that some deck would want this. Mostly if there are decks that are just interested in having more things that dodge board wipes, I guess. That's usually the strongest point of vehicles. This plays kind of nicely against Meat Hook Massacre, I suppose. But like most cards, it's a matter of opportunity cost. What thing in the 3-drop slot are you not playing instead of it? And can you do something better? And there are a lot of very strong things you can do with 3 mana, so I don't know. Yeah, it's not terribly far away from Luris, in a sense. Especially because, unlike Luris, you can actually, if you have 3 mana, play this out and not have to immediately worry about it getting killed in the same way that you have to worry about your Luris immediately getting killed. On the other hand, Luris essentially gets to use the ability with haste if you have extra mana, whereas this never can do that. And also Luris is an 8th card. Turns out companions are good. But as far as the actual effect goes, yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad. Imperial Subduer. 2 and a white for a 3/2 creature human samurai. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, tap target creature you don't control. That seems limited only. Maybe if it cost 1 mana, we'd be playing in Constructed. As a 3/2, we probably super would. Intercessor's Arrest. 2 and a white for an enchantment aura. Enchant permanent. Enchanted permanent can't attack, block, crew vehicles. Its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. Probably a decent, good, limited removal spell. Invoke Justice. 1 and 4 white, 5 mana total, for a sorcery. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then distribute 4+1/+1 counters among any number of creatures and or vehicles target player controls. Interesting. Okay, 5 mana is a lot. Quadruple white is a lot, but return any permanent with no sizing restriction to the battlefield, and then you get 4+1/+1 counters worth of haste? The color typing restriction makes it hard to splash into anything that has easy access to discard outlets. I imagine most of the reason you would want to play this card would either be because you want to reanimate something that isn't a creature, because you can reanimate a creature more easily than this, or you want to include this in a deck that's aggressive, because the 4+1/+1 counters with haste is actually kind of decent. It's interesting that you can put the +1/+1 counters on a vehicle and then just return something that crews the vehicle. Velomachus is a cool card to invoke. That's true. What's the size restriction on what Velomachus can hit? Is it at 5 drops? Oh, it hits based on Velomachus's power. So if you invoke Justice to put a Velomachus into play, you can cast 9 drops out of your deck? But also, if you hit and invoke Justice with an attacking Velomachus, you can just put the counters on it to do more damage immediately. Huh. So any deck that has Velomachus plus Invoke Justice, if the Velomachus is in the graveyard, you have to be worried about them casting an Invoke Justice from hand to make a 9-power Velomachus, swinging with haste, hitting Invoke Justice off the top, get a 13-power Velomachus for 5 mana, swinging with haste in the air. Instantly turns on Coven if that matters to you. That's true. I don't know that there are like a huge amount of Coven payoffs that are playable. There's the green thing that lets you play cards from the top of your library with Coven, if I recall. And there is the 2-drop that can essentially become unblockable for 2 mana if you have Coven. That's a big deal. Means you don't gotta go black for Reanimator. Yeah. This is definitely a better reanimation card than anything we've seen on a black recently. The second invoke hits Blade Historian. Maybe. I don't know. I'm actually kind of higher on Invoke Justice than I think I had any right to expect to be originally. Like, 4+1/+1 counters with haste is a nice way to turn the card into a backup aggro plan. Trotsky, thanks for the follow. Glad you're enjoying the stream. Alright. Maybe I'm on board for Justice. Between Invoke Justice, Refurbish, and the other white Reanimate and brought back, you can run mono white Reanimator. Brought Back's kind of a weird one. It requires the permanent to have entered the graveyard from the battlefield that turn, I think. And that's a little more nuanced. Where's the haste? Not sure what you mean by the 4 counters with haste. So you can give the 4 counters with haste. The reason that I say that is because you put them on targets that were already on the battlefield. They're not required to go on what you just returned with Invoke Justice. So if you reanimate some random 5-drop just because it's the best thing in your graveyard, well, you can put the 4+1/+1 counters on your 3/1 flyer that was already in play and attack with those counters immediately that turn. Retrieve sucks. Alright, we can do that. Be right back. He always seems so satisfied when he's in the very last room in the house that I haven't looked in yet. Do-do-do. Alright. Let's see. Next up, Kitsune Ace. 1 and a white for a 2/2 creature fox pilot. Whenever a vehicle you control attacks, choose 1. That vehicle gains first strike until end of turn, or untap Kitsune Ace. Really? Seems probably limited only, but untapping the ace, I guess, to be able to block? Kind of a curious ability. Well, yeah, limited only, I'm thinking. Kyodai, Soul of Kamigawa. 3 and a white for a 3/3 legendary creature dragon spirit. Flash, flying. Whenever Kyodai, Soul of Kamigawa enters the battlefield, another target permanent gains indestructible for as long as you control Kyodai. And then activated ability Wooburg. Kyodai gets +5/+5 until end of turn. So, I guess this does a pretty interesting approximation of Restoration Angel, doesn't it? It doesn't re-trigger ETBs or anything, but at least in terms of saving stuff from removal spells, I guess not exile-based removal spells, but you give something indestructible permanently for as long as Kyodai is in play, meaning you, like, fizzle a removal spell on your annoying permanent, and then they gotta kill Kyodai before they can kill your annoying permanent again? Doesn't work against rats. It does sort of work against rats. You do save one permanent, although you do immediately lose the Kyodai. So, I guess, like, I'm thinking Thalia would be kind of annoying. They use a removal spell on Thalia, expecting that they're going to get their mana discount back. And Kyodai pops in and says, oh, no. If you want to kill that Thalia, actually you have to kill me first with another expensive spell, and then you get to play your third expensive spell on Thalia to finally kill it. 4 is a lot to play for a trick like that. Yeah, but coming with 3 power in the air at Flash is pretty nice. And it's the kind of trick that not only is it useful against decks with removal spells, it also just happens to be useful against decks that have creatures. Because snapping off Kyodai after attacks and before blocks gives you a 3/3 to block with, and lets you block with another indestructible creature. It's reasonable. I don't know if there's necessarily a deck that does want to use its 4-drop slot for that, but the effect is close to standard playable. Now again, we do run into the problem that a pretty significant amount of removal in Standard and Alchemy is exile-based. So if white-black removal tends to be the standard, then this doesn't do anything. It also doesn't do anything against Meathook Massacre. So with where the current metagame is at, I don't see this playing a significant role in Standard, but this will be in Standard for a long time, and cards like this have been decent before. I would ultimately define it as not like something that's exciting or pulls me into building a deck, but I wouldn't be surprised if like one sees play in random decks. Also bad versus 2 removal, since you can respond by removing Kyodai. Yes, if you have the ability to use 2 removal spells at that time. Meaning, 2 removal spells doesn't do anything if they don't have open mana to immediately kill the Kyodai in response to their first removal spell. But it's the kind of thing that you could theoretically play around. Next up, Light the Way. Single white for an instant, choose 1, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle, untap it, or return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. Huh. Okay. Well, it's not a bad combat trick in the sense that it's flexible. I don't think that it's impactful enough to want to play it, but there's a lot of flexibility tied up in this. I certainly could see myself playing this in limited decks, but I don't see an immediate draw to any particular standard deck. I do like the idea of bouncing sagas, but that's probably not a good idea. Not when you actually have to pay to recast the saga. You taking off already, Socks? Alright, bye-bye. Next up, Light Paws, Emperor's Voice. 1 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature, Fox Advisor. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to that aura, and with a different name than each aura you control, put that card onto the battlefield attached to Light Paws, Emperor's Voice, then shuffle. Light Paw replaces 2 Rams in Historic, maybe all 4? I don't think any. Like, I don't know exactly how you build this card, but the problem is, it does nothing if you cast a 1-drop aura. It does nothing if you cast a duplicate aura. The best I can say is that in white-black auras, it makes it so that a 2-mana aura could tutor up a ghost form. It works with 1-mana auras. Oh, okay, equal to, not just less than. Yeah, I guess. can't imagine replacing a SRAM. I guess I could imagine playing more Light Paws. But yeah, I think this ability is probably weaker than Draw a Card, would be my guess. It's fun with Flash Auras. Yeah. I suppose I would leave it to other deck builders to try to figure out how valuable the toolbox element of this is, because the toolbox element comes at the cost of just not playing as many copies of your good auras. It's also not on cast. It sort of is on cast, right? It's on enter. It's on enter if you cast it. So, oh, right. Meaning that if the aura gets countered, then you don't get the ability, so it's weaker. So it's on both, essentially. Auras decks naturally want to have lots of one-of unique effects. Well, I wouldn't say that they naturally want to have that. They just kind of have to by virtue of how much room they have right now. But there are certainly some auras you would much rather play more of. And cutting the auras you would rather play more of to play more silver bullet auras that are going to be bad or worse when you draw them naturally, I'm not sure if that's a huge benefit to the deck in terms of reliability. Yeah, that's true. Not even just counter spells, but also if they just play a removal spell on Light Paw's Voice. So with a SRAM, for example, you could go SRAM, immediately play Ghost Form, and if they remove your SRAM in response, you still drew a card, so you only got 1-for-1. With Light Paw's Voice, if they have a removal spell in response to your follow-up enchantment, you did actually get 2-for-1, which ain't great. I do suspect it's probably a good card. I just don't think the deck gets improved by cutting SRAMs for this card. I would see this as like the 9th and the 10th Pant Lord, which I think was something the deck already wanted to do and just couldn't do. Like, White-Black Auras plays Claim, and I think this card is probably just something you would rather have than Claim. Maybe that's not true, but I think that's the case. Is the SRAM deck Cheerios or something else? It is very similar to Cheerios. It's a historic auras deck where you play SRAM, and it's basically Boggles, more or less, except its creatures don't have hexproof. Half Cheerios, half Boggles. Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. It's the non-combo half of Cheerios and the non-hexproof half of Boggles. I suppose Light Paw's Voice might actually also be interesting with the Rune deck, because there is the 3-drop card that makes runes cost 1 mana to cast, and tutors a rune when it enters the battlefield, and all runes draw cards when they enter the battlefield. And this goes off the mana value of the card that entered the battlefield, not the amount of mana spent to cast it. So if you put a rune onto something for 1 mana, you can go tutor a different rune that is a 3-drop and just draw 2 cards. That's kind of interesting. That actually does make Light Paws into a real card advantage engine. That was kind of one of the things that deck was missing. It didn't have a lot of use for the runes whenever it drew them naturally if it didn't have whatever that 3-drop is that makes them cost 1 generic mana. Man, there might be something there. That might be worth brewing. Lion Sash. 1 and a white for an artifact creature equipment cat. 1/1. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. Reconfigure 2. So, a Scavenging Ooze that is an artifact and an equipment, which is a lot more tutorable, that can also be equipped to something randomly, but starts with 1 less power, but also gets a +1/+1 counter for any card that's a permanent that's exiled, not just creatures. Meaning fetch lands. Or just generic lands, or, well, a bunch of stuff, but doesn't gain life. There are a lot of ways to make the runes cost 0, yeah. That definitely could get extremely interesting, couldn't it? Lion Sash seems like it's probably going to be a card that sees a lot of play in a lot of formats, but I suspect its role is probably going to be similar to Scavenging Ooze in that it does not strike me as the kind of card that is inherently powerful, and is instead powerful and possibly main deckable based on a metagame. And at least in the case of Historic right now, Scavenging Ooze is a totally acceptable main deck card, and every deck that can tries to main deck Graveyard Hate. And this is certainly extremely main deckable Graveyard Hate. Stoneforge tutorable Skoos, yes. Yeah, equipments and artifacts are much easier to tutor. This is extremely true. Yeah, strikes me as a very solid card. Wouldn't be surprised to see play in just about any format, although I guess not Standard or Alchemy necessarily. There's not a ton of incentive for Graveyard Hate in those formats right now, and I don't think Lion Sash... Well, no, hold on, that's not true. This actually does really inconvenience Edgar, because you can exile it before it returns to the battlefield. And Edgar is one of the permanents that I've found to be most troublesome for most decks to deal with. Although, white is one of the colors that's less true of. But, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this still sees play in Standard. Lion Sash does a pretty cute thing with dodging removal while attached. Yeah, that's fair, if you want to try to protect it from a board wipe. There's some optionality to the play there that's rather interesting. Yeah, seems like a super solid card for decks to have access to. I don't think that it's going to, be a 4-of in standard decks or anything, but very powerful to have the option to access. Next up, Lucky Offering. Single white for a sorcery. Destroy target artifact with mana value 3 or less. You gain 3 life. So, does not hit enchantments, doesn't hit larger artifacts, but gains 3 life. This strikes me as the kind of card that could maybe start seeing sideboard play if very specific artifact aggro decks, vehicle decks in particular I suppose come to mind, show up, and you just really want to dedicate sideboard space to a card that super hoses one very specific kind of deck. So I would give it situationally very potent sideboard card, but my expectation would be that it's probably not terribly likely that a deck shows up that this is so specifically positioned against that it's useful. But maybe, I don't know. But yeah, would see play not necessarily on the strength of its own merits so much as the vulnerability of some other very popular deck to it. March of Otherworldly Light. X and a white. Instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of white cards from your hand. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. Exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. Huh. Let me go let the kitty out. He just stares at the door so sadly. Artifact, creature, or enchantment. So if you want to kill a 4-drop, you have to spend 5 mana, or spend 3 mana and discard a card. Not even discard, exile a card. And the card from your hand has to be white. This seems hard for me to imagine being good. It is flexible, but generally speaking, my opinion is that removal needs to be efficient to be good, not flexible. If it did Planeswalkers, maybe it would be flexible enough for me to be interested, but like, I can't think of that many cards I would be excited to pay the amount of mana this is asking me to pay. And I certainly don't want a 2-for-1 myself. Maybe if this could, like, exile it from the stack so you could deny ETBs, I'd be interested in 2-for-1ing myself, but this is after something enters the battlefield. Am I supposed to be excited about paying 5 mana to get rid of a Edgar? Prismatic Ending is seeing tons of play, but Prismatic Ending costs 1 less mana than this, and that's a huge difference, right? Because Prismatic Ending, to kill a 2-drop, you spend 2 mana. This, to kill a 2-drop, you have to spend 3 mana. You can also Prismatic Ending Planeswalkers. In a world where flexibility winds up mattering more than efficiency, this is a card you could play. But I would say that the majority of metagames I have ever played in seem to value efficiency over flexibility, at least at the rate this card is offering. So I would not expect this to see play, but I suppose it wouldn't surprise me if really slow, dirtily decks are enough of the meta that the cost this is asking to pay winds up becoming acceptable. It's good if you want to stop 0 CMC cards, or if you have to stop some kind of combo deck. But what kind of combo deck are you stopping with instant speed exile-based removal? It's this expensive. Most of the time, I mean, I guess, yeah, this kills tokens, and maybe if there's a deck out there with enough tokens that somehow cost enough mana, this is worth playing. Yeah, right. The fact that March can never actually be 0 mana makes the exile any number of cards mode seem like not actually relevant to me, really. Paying white plus an extra card to knock out Painter Servant seems okay. But is there any format where you would want to do that when you could just play like Path to Exile instead? Or Swords to Plowshares in a Painter Servant world? I don't know. Standard at least doesn't seem fast enough that I can't see any permanent that I need to remove from play so desperately that I'm willing to do this. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, like, even exiling a 1-drop for 2 mana seems like it sucks. I don't know. I'm not really seeing it. This card's a standard / pioneer nerfed version of Prismatic Ending. Right, but like, if the nerfed version of Prismatic Ending is worse than the already existing standard removal, then it's not necessarily nerfed Prismatic Ending, except for in the same sense that pacifism is a nerfed Path to Exile. Like, yeah, kind of, but not really. Perhaps in the white aura deck that swims in card advantage? Yeah, but like, even if you have a bunch of card advantage, why do you want this? I don't know. Yeah, Force of Will isn't very exciting in Standard either, and Force of Will is a much stronger card than this. And yeah, Force of Will is already a card I probably wouldn't play in Standard, because card advantage is so important. I don't even know if Force of Will would have been good against Epiphany. Maybe it would have been fine. It would have changed stuff, but that's probably getting too sidetracked. Prismatic is good because it's always going 1-for-1 in terms of mana. Yeah, Prismatic Ending being mana equal, although sorcery speed means not opportunity cost equal, is probably better than March of Otherworldly Light. Instant speed being sometimes an advantage on opportunity cost, but if you're going toe-to-toe with the opponent on land drops, it doesn't matter whether you're on the play or the draw. March of the Otherworldly Light never answers something at instant speed that they're playing on curve, because if they're on the draw, the turn they play their 5th drop, you have access to 5 mana, which isn't enough to march it. It just seems so bad. How about versus Thalia? Yeah, I suppose that's true. Prismatic is still a 2-mana removal spell for Thalia, whereas March of the Otherworldly Light is a 4-mana answer to Thalia. Kind of a big deal. Not against Epiphany, it's good in Epiphany. Yeah, that might be true. Mostly only versus Epiphany deck mirrors, though. There's not a lot of other decks I would have ever wanted to use a Force of Will against. White ramp style decks that have excess mana don't mind the cost. I can see them being playable. But if you're spending your early turns ramping, you want your expensive spells to be stuff that is tempo positive in terms of being like a big expensive Wrath of God that 2-for-1s your opponent. I don't want the first thing I do after ramping to be play a very overcosted removal spell that's removes 1 permanent like March of Otherworldly Light. I want to have my 6-drop I play after ramping or my 5-drop I play after ramping be a board wipe that answers multiple permanents all at once that built up while I was doing nothing. Seems like a potential metagame card. Maybe? I struggle to imagine a metagame where March of the Otherworldly Light is what I want to be doing, but the playable removal is the best removal available. Maybe March of Otherworldly Light ends up being the best removal available that kills an Edgar in some decks. Like if you want to play like a blue-white deck, and you just don't have other options. I just don't necessarily know what pulls you in that direction. Next up, Michiko's Reign of Truth. 1 and a white for a saga. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment you control, of which this is 1. Second chapter does the same thing, then comes back as Portrait of Michiko, enchantment creature, human noble. It is a 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. Okay. Huh. That is actually a lot of pumped stats, and then a creature in a deck that is dedicated to being artifacts and enchantments. This doesn't seem immediately strong, but if the tools are there for an aggressive deck that just floods the boards with artifacts and enchantments, this is certainly a lot of power that swings fast and then turns into a creature. Alright. I mean, super synergistic decks like this tend to live and die by whether they have enough tools to get up to 60 cards, but I could see this actually being a role player in a really dedicated linear archetype. Yeah, the big one that comes to mind is Blue-White Affinity and Historic. I don't think that deck has room for this, but a version of that in Standard or Alchemy that has access to fewer good old cards might be reasonable. Is there an aggro deck with Alseid? Aura's technically is an aggro deck that sometimes plays Alseid, although I don't think that it plays Alseid anymore. But yeah, there might be now. Or rather, there might be a aggro deck that plays enough artifacts and enchantments in Standard or Alchemy now. I don't see there being a reason to run Alseid in Historic. Like, the lifelink and pumping it is, I suppose, kind of cool, but there's a lot of decks that are very good at inconveniencing that right now in Historic. A lot of removal running around. It makes me kind of leery about trying to build up a board state of creatures and then pumping them at sorcery speed. Sounds like kind of getting blown out by Unholy Heats and green-black's various suite of removal. Though, maybe Reign of Truth ends up being kind of decent in a deck that has Esper Sentinel, which, yeah, blue-white aura, or blue-white artifacts affinity is the deck that it would seem like it slots most into, but I don't think there's room in that deck for this. I don't think any Boggle Shell could ever play this, because it already has access to All That Glitters, which actually synergizes with the Aura's card draw engine, and that already is something that they were beginning to trim in that deck, because just going bigger wasn't what the deck needed to do to stop from losing the matchups that it was losing. Blood tokens, maybe? White-black blood token stuff tends to be more mid-rangey in Alchemy, and doesn't necessarily want this kind of an aggressive effect, I think. Hey, Bon Bonito! Thanks for the raid! How'd the stream go? Y'all join us in the midst of, let's see, we're about an hour and a half into the set review, and we've made it about halfway through White. So we're entirely on curve to finish this in about 8 hours. Bon Bonito, Forgotten Tea, and Fresh Prince of Balearin. Alright, I dig that name. I dig that name a lot. Thanks for following. Glad you're enjoying what you've seen so far. Alright, next up, Moth Rider Patrol. 1 mana, 1/1 flyer, creature type Fox Warrior. Ability, 3 and a white, tap it, tap target creature. Unless the warrior typing really matters a lot, stats probably aren't there for constructed. Probably solid limited card, though. Might be the best 1-drop 1/1 flyer we've ever seen for limited at common. Tapping target creature is such a really strong ability for your 1-drop to have. You don't usually want to remove it, or you don't usually want to use it until late game, but if you can get in like 3 damage with this early and then use the ability later, that's actually really rather appealing. Set reviews take forever, don't they? Yeah. Most everyone I've ever done tends to take 8 to 10 hours, so I'm buckled in for the long run here. Lantern Bearer was pretty insane and limited. That's true. That's true. Although, Lantern Bearer, maybe not technically a 1-drop, in the sense that so much of its playability was based on it being played as a, what was the other side, a 2-drop or a 3-drop? I think it was a 3-drop, right? But yeah, probably not better than Lantern Rider, if only for the synergies that Lantern Rider had. But I would say that in a cube environment, I would probably rather play Moth Rider Patrol than Lantern Bearer. But apples to oranges in that sense is kind of hard to compare. Alright, next up, Norika Yamazaki the Poet. 2 and a white for a 3/2 legendary creature human samurai with vigilance. Whenever a samurai or a warrior you control attacks alone, you may cast target enchantment card from your graveyard this turn. Can't compare fruit. Well, you can. but it's difficult to compare if one apple is better than one orange, or at least a lot harder than to compare if one apple is better than another apple. Any plan on playing Master Duel soon? I did play Master Duel a couple of times over the last weeks. It was interesting. I might play it again, although I'm probably not going to have time, at least for probably like a month or two. Because when Kamigawa comes out, I'm probably going to start going hard on testing for the set championship. But yeah, I started learning Sky Strikers, which I'm still probably only like 5% actually understanding the game, but it was fun. Enjoyed it. And also free. I wish. I think I spent like $70 building that one deck. It's tough. But I'm happy for the folks who did have an easy time building decks cheap on the client. Alright. Norika Yamazaki the Poet. 2 and a white for a 3/2 legendary creature, human samurai. Vigilance: whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, you may cast target enchantment card from your graveyard this turn. So you still have to pay the cost, but you get to rebuy the effects. I would almost be tempted to say this is a limited only card, because I do think that it's good in limited, but I don't know. The fact that this has pseudo haste, because you can have a different samurai or warrior attack alone, that could be an interesting... So you don't get a timing exception on it because it doesn't say you may cast target enchantment card, period. It just says this turn. So whatever enchantment you get with this still has to be cast during your next main phase. So you can't like flash in a pacifism or anything. But maybe? We've seen a lot of cards in this set that are really built around in the sense that they have a lot of restrictions and narrow payoffs, and the quality is only really evident when you see the entirety of a 60-card list and whether it's reliably enabling and protecting itself. Those are always the hardest decks to build, and they're certainly the hardest decks to predict ahead of time without seeing a list whether they would get there. I could see this being an engine in a deck, but it strikes me as not super likely to come together and result in something very powerful. The stat line for a 3-drop is also pretty easy to kill, which isn't exciting. There's quite a few enchantment warriors, so this is self-sustaining. Sort of. In a sense, if you get multiple of them. Because of the way this targets, you can't attack with one enchantment warrior and have it like be able to recast itself after it dies, because you have to choose your target before damage gets dealt, but a couple of them could loop. That seems almost exclusively limited only, though. That seems way too slow for standard, most likely. I don't know. I would rate this as a card that could have potential, but like needs an entire deck built around it, and I don't immediately see a way for that to happen. Regent's Authority. Single white instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If it's an enchantment creature or a legendary creature, instead put a +1/+1 counter on it and gets a +1/+1 until end of turn. Sure, limited only. Can't really use combat tricks that don't protect your creatures generally. Repel the Vile, 3 and a white for an instant, choose 1, exile target creature with power 4 or greater, exile target enchantment, too expensive, limited only. The Restoration of Iganjo, 2 and a white for a saga. Search your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Second, you may discard a card. When you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. which could be lands, I guess. 3rd, exile the saga, then return to the battlefield transformed under your control. Returns as Architect of Restoration. Is a 3/4 with Vigilance. Whenever it attacks or blocks, create a 1/1 colorless spirit token. Huh. For 3 mana, huh? The creature this flips into is pretty decent, but it's pretty slow about getting there, and the first 2 sagas chapters are not great. I don't know. I'm not, like, super enthusiastic about it, even though I am kind of enthusiastic about the creature half. It does ramp you on the 2nd saga, but only if you actually have a card in the graveyard to get. Oh, you may hold on, you're right. You may discard a card as the first line of text on that. So you can just discard the planes you got. Oh, when you do... Oh, so you don't even get the return unless you discard a card. Huh. Oh, that's hard to imagine. So you could choose to discard a creature if you just want a discounted ability to play something that turn. Oh, or you could discard a land. Presumably you're just discarding whatever you want to get back, with possible exceptions in the late game of you can discard something that's useless to get back something that already died that's useful. Okay, so thinking about that, I don't know if this card is good, but I will say I think this card is really cool, because now having realized how that 2nd chapter works, that 2nd chapter is everything I like in card design, where it's a ton of options and choices that do meaningful different things. I love cards that make me make meaningful choices. Neat. Is this a control card? I don't know. It's not inherently a card that control wants more than something else, I suppose. It's, if you think of it as a white ramp spell that is really slow about how it ramps you and then turns into a blocker, maybe that's something control wants more than anything else? But... Huh. A 3/4 is pretty decent against aggro, but this comes down so slow. You don't have the blocker until turn 5, which is already when, like, you desperately need to be stabilizing anyway. I could see it. I could see this seeing play, but it does not strike me as a card that is inherently super powerful. It strikes me as a card that is probably solid. The one thing I would say is that makes me suspicious it's probably not a control card, and this might be wrong. It feels like you want the 2nd chapter to be able to get back meaningful non-lands. And I also don't think this is an aggro card, but, like, what kind of super meaningful 2 mana value permanent cards are you returning to play with this if you're, like, discarding bad cards in a specific matchup? Fiddlebender? I don't think so. You also play a turn 3 to get a land for board wipe turn 4. So The land comes back to the battlefield tapped, so it doesn't ramp you into a 5-drop on the turn after you play it. You only get a ramp on the 3rd turn after you've played it. Well, or 2nd turn after you played it, depending on how you want to call that. But you go from 3 mana to 4 mana to 6 mana. You don't discard land? Well, you do if you want to reanimate the land with the 2nd chapter. Just because I'm presuming it's hard to get land into the graveyard any other way than discarding it to that ability in a world where you want to use this to ramp. Fable and Evolving Wilds? Yeah, but then you have to include Fabled Passage or Evolving Wilds in your deck. And I don't like doing that. Those lands aren't good. Actually, Evolving Wilds is extra terrible, because Evolving Wilds, if you return Evolving Wilds with Restoration, having Evolving Wilds intertapped means that's 1 additional turn before you can get mana out of it. Fabled Passage, at least, by that point comes in untapped, so that's not as terrible. But that means you had to play Fabled Passage as a tap land on turn 1 or 2. Turn 1's fine, but turn 2 isn't, and you couldn't play it on turn 3 because you needed to play Restoration on curve. So, like, your Restoration, if your plan is to use those, is... I don't know. Mnemonic Sphere, artifact, 1 and a blue, sacrifice Mnemonic Sphere, draw 2 cards. So if your turn 2 is play Mnemonic Sphere, your turn 3 is Restoration of Iganjo, then on turn 4 you can sack the sphere in your upkeep, discard a card, get the sphere back. But you've committed to spending like your entire game plan doing nothing on the first couple of turns? I feel like whatever permanent you return with this, if it's not going to be a land, has to be something... Just channel... Oh, the sphere has a 1 and a blue... Or 1 blue, discard it, draw a card, I guess? And you can return it? I think if you're not returning a land with this card, you inherently want to be returning something that is making an impact on the board state. Like some kind of meaningful blocker. Or, like, Pacifism is not a card I want to play in limited necessarily, or in standard necessarily, but if you discard a Pacifism to this ability and then return that immediately to play and put it on something, that makes Restoration of Iganjo actually recover a bit of the tempo that you're losing by playing it. That seems possibly interesting. So, entering tapped means you can't really immediately get a blocker, I suppose, but... Yeah, alright. I feel like this is going to take some experimenting with, but it feels like this has enough modality and optionality to it that with the right deck building I could see this being a powerful card. I'm interested to play around with this. Seems like a cool card. I hope it's a good card. Selfless Samurai. 1 and a white for a 2/2 creature Fox Samurai. Whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, it gains lifelink until end of turn. Sacrifice Selfless Samurai. Another target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. Okay. Well, actually, this is more or less exactly what I was just thinking might be a decent kind of 2-drop to synergize with Restoration of Iganjo. It is something you can discard to Restoration of Iganjo and put into play that also just immediately gives you a way to protect your Architect of Restoration. It's really a shame that the Architect's Restoration doesn't gain anything from the lifelink ability, but this seems like one of the kind of cool things you could do with this second chapter that has me interested in different ways to build it. That said, on its own, 2/2 is a pretty low amount of stats. And although this ability is actually really cool, I don't know whether that ability will be enough to make it playable. Selfless Samurai seems like the kind of card that could be interesting for creature decks to play against other creature decks, though. Samurai seems strong, but how often will you have it sacked before you play Resto? I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily comparable. Having a 2-drop that you can play on turn 2 that just gives you insulation against board wipes. So compare Selfless Savior, 1 mana 1/1 with no lifelink synergy that has the same ability. Selfless Savior is probably much better because if you're looking for a protection effect, lower investment into it is preferable, but it's an example of how that style of effect can be good enough to play if the opportunity cost of how much you're paying for it isn't too high. Maybe the opportunity cost of your 2-drop slot is too high to play Selfless Samurai, but maybe not. Maybe it's what you want. That said, once again, a pretty significant amount of the removal in Standard right now is either Exile-based or -X based, and Selfless Samurai does not line up against that meaningfully at all. So, might not be getting anywhere with that. Next up, Seven-Tail Mentor, 3 and a white for a 2/3 creature fox samurai. When Seven-Tail Mentor enters the battlefield or dies, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. That is limited only. Maybe it costs 2 less mana. Skybless Samurai, 6 and a white for a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai. This spell costs 1 less for each enchantment you control, flying. Okay, affinity for enchantments. Affinity is a historically busted mechanic, but it's a lot harder to play 1 and 0 mana enchantments than it is to play 1 and 0 mana artifacts, and I don't think we've got any non-basic enchantment lands just yet. So I'm going to go with probably not, but all it takes is the right support for this to be a very powerful payoff. I just don't suspect it's very likely that support gets there. There's a card with affinity for artifacts too. There are sagas, but sagas are kind of expensive. Like, affinity 7-drops have historically been good when you play them on turn 2 or turn 3. You are not playing this card on turn 2 or turn 3, I don't think, because you're definitely not playing 3 or 4 enchantments in your first 2. Oh, the Urza Saga is an enchantment land? I suppose. I still don't think you're getting to a scenario where you have 6 Urza Sagas in play, though. Probably not. But yeah, that's fair. That is an enchantment land, huh? If we get another 3 or 4 Urza Sagas, maybe we're on to something. Best you can do is use Nico Eris to make a bunch of shards. And that's true. Those are ways to make enchantment tokens. But, yeah. I don't feel like Skybless Samurai is going to be a good card if you're playing it on turn 5 or 6. I feel like it's the kind of card you need to play on turn 3 or 4 to be good, and I don't see that. At least not yet. Spirited Companion, 1 and a white for a 1/1 enchantment creature dog. When Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. Okay. So we have Elvish Visionary, except for dogs, or more realistically, except for an enchantment. I would say that this is very clearly good, and especially considering it triggers enchantment synergies, has potential to be very, very good in specific scenarios. Huh. This will be interesting to see. This is the kind of glue that can make a lot of different types of decks stick together, but isn't like inherently busted on its own, but rather becomes busted with synergies. So interesting to see what sort of synergies arise. I could potentially see the Enchantress deck in Historic playing some of these, because it includes its own natural card draw, in addition to the card draw from all of your various Enchantress effects. But similar to Elvish Visionary, that mostly only ends up seeing play when it synergizes with other cards in the deck, I don't think this would see play on its own. Or what was the Black Vampire version of this effect? 2 mana 1/1 that drew a card. Mostly only saw play because it had vampire synergies. So, I suppose we'll see. Sunblade Samurai, 4 and a white for a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai with vigilance. Channel for 2. Discard Sunblade Samurai. Search your library for a basic plains card, reveal, put it into your hand, then shuffle, you gain 2 life. As tempting as it is to just dismiss this and say, oh, limited card. Dusk Legion Zealot, that was the other one. But as tempting as it is to dismiss this and say, limited card, for 2 mana, no restriction on colors, you get to put 2 types into the graveyard for Delirium. That's actually really interesting. And fixes for white mana for colorless. Enchantment is a hard type to get in the graveyard, and so is creature. This is going to sound weird, but the biggest problem with Sunblade Samurai is that it requires you to play a number of creatures. It requires you to play a number of basic planes, which is rough. But I could almost envision playing Sunblade Samurai in Historic Jeskai Control if I wanted to go for Unholy Heat. You gain 2 life, you get the card back, and the only opportunity cost was paying 2 colorless mana on turn 2 at instant speed, and you put 2 of the hardest types to get into the graveyard. But it's so hard to play that many planes. That's an interesting deck construction problem, but that actually is really interesting. I could actually see this seeing play if all of the other kind of puzzle pieces come together there. It's too bad it can't get any planes. If it could get like a dual land planes, I would like immediately be jamming 4 of these into a lot of my constructed control decks. Oh. Alas, not quite there, huh? Alright, Touch the Spirit Realm. 2 and a white. Enchantment. When Touch the Spirit Realm enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature until Touch the Spirit Realm leaves the battlefield. Channel. 1 and a white. Discard Touch the Spirit Realm. Exile target artifact or creature. Return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next in-step. If this hit enchantments, I would be so excited. Oh, why doesn't it hit enchantments? I just want to blink Demonic Pacts. Why do we have to put text on cards that stops me from blinking Demonic Pacts? Anyway, so this is an O-ring for creatures that you can pay 2 mana to blink your sagas with. That's actually like a rate that's kind of close to interesting. Or rather, you can blink the sagas from this set that turn into creatures once they've turned into creatures. I should be more specific. That's pretty flexible. O-Ring is a card that has seen play occasionally. It's never been good when it saw play, and admittedly, O-Ring is more flexible than this in terms of what it hits. But yeah, the fact that this can be a removal spell against other creature decks and can be a defensive tool against decks that are trying to remove your stuff if O-Ring isn't relevant, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Hey Chris, how are you? Imagines fetching triumphs. Yeah, wouldn't that be great? I wish. And I'm doing fine. Or rather, I'm not doing fine. I'm doing better than fine. I'm doing really well. Thanks for asking. So, yeah. Touch the Spirit Realm. Definitely could see play. I personally don't like paying 3 mana for removal, but it has to happen sometimes. Wanderer's Intervention. 1 and a white for an instant. Wanderer's Intervention deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Okay. Yeah, that's a limited card. There's some flavor text, though. Ooh. Just as Jin Gataxias' victory seemed certain, the Wanderer appeared. Her blade already in motion. 1 mighty slash was enough to take the Praetor out of the fight. That's actually rather impressive. You just... Okay, but... Are we trying to say Jin Gataxias got done in by 4 damage? Because I don't know if we've ever seen a Jin Gataxias that had 4 toughness or less. So maybe there was some combat damage that already happened during that combat step. Okay, but next up, the Wandering Emperor. 2 white for a legendary planeswalker, no type, 3 loyalty, flash. As long as the Wandering Emperor entered the battlefield this turn, you may activate her loyalty abilities anytime you could cast an instant. +1, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature and gains first strike until end of turn. -1, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. -2, exile target tapped creature, you gain 2 life. Ooh. This card's interesting. This card's really interesting and really weird. It's tricky to say what the most common use case for this would be. This is a very different design to a lot of planeswalkers we've seen in the past, and I'm trying to envision what the typical play pattern most of the time would be. So, you presumably almost always want to play this with Flash. Doing it at sorcery speed, the only real benefit is that you can give something a +1/+1 counter and attack. Or rather, I guess you could do it on your turn, not necessarily sorcery speed, but you could do it on your turn after attacks, and then buff one of your creatures with an uptick to win some kind of trade, which could be useful. I think the typical play pattern is Vraska's Contempt with upside. Not quite. Because Vraska's Contempt, you can hit their 4-drop they just played that turn. Wandering Emperor does require them to have already attacked with the creature, which means if you're playing Emperor on 4, you're removing something that is inherently not a 4-drop. So you're not going even on mana terribly often during a curve-out scenario. And you're never hitting a Planeswalker, which is kind of the only reason Vraska's Contempt saw play. If you exile a creature with Emperor, then on your next turn, you probably have to uptick. And if it's in a control deck, that's not accomplishing anything because you probably don't have a creature. If you're down-ticking to make a creature because you just want to play a flash threat, then I think when this card is good, it's probably good because it's making a flash threat. I think if you're flashing this in to do the -2, it's probably not a great card. Not unless you're playing it in a creature deck that cares about the uptick, where the uptick is meaningful. And I think that requires you to be a deck that's actually pressuring your opponent. I don't think I'm too interested in this in a control deck. In any format where Shark Typhoon exists, probably. Seems pretty slow for a pressure card. Yeah, it's not hugely fast. And that does concern me. Mono white would benefit the most, maybe, but I think this card is considerably worse than Gideon Blackblade when it comes to being an aggressive card. Because Gideon Blackblade is a lot harder to remove as a threat. Whereas Emperor, you can make a 2-2 that is dodges sorcery speed board wipe, but I'm not actually convinced this card is very good. I have difficulty seeing what kind of deck plays Wandering Emperor and actually is pulling ahead because it does it. The restriction on hitting only tapped creatures makes this a lot weaker than I think it looks at first glance. Think you -2 on your turn no matter what since you flash in after the creatures attack you. Well, you can do it before combat damage, and that could wind up being relevant if otherwise you're going to get lethaled. The problem is that after you exile something that's attacked you, that if you're curving out Wandering Emperor, means you got something that is not as expensive as the card you just played. You don't really have a good play the next turn. You can either sack Emperor to make a 2-2, which probably wasn't great, or you uptick to give a counter to something so that you can then downtick for 2, which also isn't great. Could be a sideboard card against control in white aggro decks and standard. I'm not actually... Is that good? I'm not sure if that's actually good. Like, a 4-drop that flashes in and starts making 2-2s? What's that accomplishing? 2-2s with haste? I guess? 1 2-2 with haste? Like... That's not actually what you want to do against control with an aggressive deck, I don't think. How many instant speed threats does mono white have versus control? Not many, but that doesn't answer the question of whether instant speed threats are inherently good, or whether an instant speed threat needs to be good enough against control. Because an instant speed 2-2 is not collected company. Eventually those tokens get bigger with the +1. Yeah, but like... at a very slow, manageable rate. I don't know. I mean, I think this card could be good in the right scenarios, and it's flexible. I just don't think it's actually, like... It's very difficult for me to see a scenario in a game that is curving out where this card is a blowout. Maybe this card is very good once you hit a top deck scenario where both players are low on resources, because it is inherently sort of a 2-for-1 or better some of the time. So maybe that's like where its home is, but I don't know if that's a good home. Or I don't know if that's a home that a deck actually cares about that exists. You want to be leaving 4 mana open, threatening to use the +1 on blocks. Yeah, I mean, I guess if your opponent... So maybe that's a good point. Maybe the Wandering Emperor is good not because of what happens when you play it, but because of how your opponent has to play around it. That if they're trying to play around all 3 modes at instant speed, then they're falling behind. Which makes it, in that case, a card that sometimes is at its best if you're not using it. Maybe it's a card that's like decent in the sense that Settle the Wreckage is decent, where forcing your opponent to play around it makes their lines suboptimal, and then you just do stuff that isn't actually this card instead. I think it's a mid-range card to fight mid-range cards, like I remove your gold spend and now I'm untapping with a Planeswalker, I guess, but if they got a treasure token and you're I guess the part of that I don't love is that there's a lot of feeling tied up in the term untapping with a Planeswalker, because we have an inherent understanding of what that term means in terms of power level. And I think untapping with a 1 loyalty Emperor probably isn't that good most of the time. I think it is probably a lot weaker than we are accustomed to thinking of untapping with a Planeswalker as being. I wouldn't be surprised if it sees play, but yeah, it definitely seems like the kind of card that requires you to be committed to the board, and I could see the Wandering Emperor just not seeing play because we end up with better stuff to do at 3 and 4 mana. 4 mana is a lot, and this does not immediately scream, I'm better than any other 4-drop you could be playing. Like, the first thing I would want to compare Wandering Emperor to, I guess, is Legion Angel. Is this a better card than Legion Angel? I don't know that it is. Really? They don't seem directly comparable, but that's the kind of thing you're comparing your 4-drop slot to if you're looking at a leaner, aggressive white deck. I don't know. I thought I was a lot more excited about Wandering Emperor before, but now that I'm actually thinking about it, the play patterns are kind of weird. I guess I didn't realize that it only hit tapped creatures, and that's probably a big part of why I'm kind of down on it now. I don't know. Alright, last white card. Whew. When we were young, 3 and a white for an instant, up to 2 target creatures, each get +2/+2 until end of turn. If you control an artifact and an enchantment, those creatures also gain lifelink until end of turn. 4 mana. Not playable. We did it! Alright, only took 2 hours.